Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Lawvere, and I'm joined with my co-host, Chris Crawford. Thank you for joining another episode with Chris and I. I am your host, Aaron Lawvere, and I have with me Chris Crawford. We wanted, again, in this effort to introduce ourselves and to eat our own dog food as interviewers, for Chris this time to interview me. So the objective of this episode is for Chris to ask me a bunch of questions and for me to fumble for answers. So we'll see how everything goes. This is episode 2 where Chris interviews me. Take it away, Chris.
All right, Aaron. So for people that may not know you, tell us a little bit about yourself outside of knives. You know, not talking about knife stuff at this point, but just who you are, what your career is, and just a little about yourself.
My name is Aaron Lawvere, obviously. I live in a little town called Arlington, Texas, which is actually not really little when compared to my birthplace, but it's out just a little bit outside of DFW. And I am married, divorced, married, remarried, and have one biological child and 3 stepchildren. And I work in cybersecurity. So I've worked in cybersecurity in one way or another since I was about 16. So I really don't know. I mean, that's about it. I just, I like hunting, fishing. We have a bunch of dogs and some reptiles and fish and things like that. And I like spending time with family, enjoying good company, and reading and discovering a lot. So those are kind of like my core tenets, I guess.
You mentioned that you live in Arlington. Have you ever met Hank Hill?
Hank Hill? No.
Do you know who that is? King of the Hill, the cartoon.
Yeah, you heckler.
Man, that's like anytime I hear Arlington, first thing I think of is Hank Hill. All right.
Yeah, but I will tell you, I do grill with propane. So
well, there you go. I was wondering who you got your propane and propane accessories from. So that's pretty funny. Well, I think you maybe mentioned this a little bit on our last one. Just talk about when we started talking. You'd asked me some questions, stuff, and that was over Instagram. And you're very active on Instagram, and I noticed I was looking at your Instagram page today, and your knife business is called Lawvere Son Knife Co. So, do you want to talk a little bit about how you came to name it that?
Sure. Well, I guess a little backstory with me and how it relates to knives is I started making knives, I think somewhere around 2016-ish, and that blossomed into me buying the knife shop from my mentor who had gotten cancer, and we can kind of go into that a little bit more in depth if you want a chronology of my knife making experience. But it was pretty low key. I was just making knives to entertain myself and as a way to push myself a little bit. And in 2018, my biological child had she was born with a congenital heart defect called hypoplastic left heart syndrome, where the left side of her heart didn't grow out in utero, and so she was born with a defect, and she had to go through a lot of surgeries, especially open heart surgeries, in order to reroute her circulation. So on her 3rd birthday, right after that, she went in for a surgery to replace her or to fix a tricuspid valve regurgitation. And it was going to be an open heart surgery. It was going to be a few hours long. Well, that surgery turned into like 12 hours. And she ended up bleeding a lot. And through a series of very unfortunate events, she ended up going into heart failure. So we were in the hospital. 2 hospitals. First, the Children's Hospital in Fort Worth, and then to Dallas Children's Hospital for her to receive a heart transplant. And during this time, right before she was in the hospital, I was talking to my mentor, John Weaver, about buying a shop, and we were kind of tossing it around. I said, I don't know what's going to happen with this surgery, so I'm going to put it off for now. And Christian, my stepson, who was 20 at the time, was excited about potentially opening up a knife business and learning the trade and everything. Because at that point, I was starting to make, you know, all right looking knives. And so we talked about it. He was going to save money. I was going to save money. We were gonna buy this thing. Well, when Evelyn went in for her heart transplant, I uh, I still was like, I just can't do it. I can't foresee spending tens of thousands of dollars in knife equipment and everything when I really don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. So a few days before Evelyn was discharged after she got her heart transplant and she was doing better, Christian, who had just gotten a motorcycle maybe like a month or two before, had tragically been hit and killed in a collision with a SUV. And, it almost losing our child to all of the surgery stuff and then losing Christian was pretty devastating. I didn't know Christian his entire life. I married in, but I loved him a lot. And for him to want to invest in this dream of making knives and maybe having to go at it as a business, I just, I thought about it and I said, I got to do it. I got to continue this trajectory of buying the shop and trying to make knives and make something of it, because that's no longer a dream that he and I can carry. It's only something that I can. So originally, I had the name of my business was Knife Co, which was a combination of Lawvere and Lau. That was my wife's family name. And I decided after everything that happened with Christian to rename it Lawvere Son Knife Co in honor of him and to carry him with me and with the knives that I make because he's not here. So that's kind of a little bit about the name.
Yeah, man, that's really special, and that's a neat tribute. That you're doing to carry his memory forward. That's really special. Thank you for sharing that. Some of my questions that I have written down to ask you about may be negated based on how some of these other answers go, because I didn't know your story, and but we'll just see how it goes. But you mentioned last time on the last podcast that went you got into knives, when you were kind of getting out of jewelry. So tell us a little bit about jewelry making. Like, how did you get into that? What was your interest? And then you can share like how, why you got out of that, I guess. But tell us a little bit about your time in jewelry making.
Some would say about me that I'm a jack of all trades, master of none. And maybe that's because when I learn a certain amount of something, if it satisfies my curiosity, then sometimes I'll move on from it. And I knew a fella in our church Sunday school group that had been a master jeweler for like 35 years. And I asked him one time if I could come and just see how he makes things and kind of observe. And he invited me into his shop to just see how the back end of the business runs. And at the time, I was in community college classes, and I was working full time, but I was working four days a week, and so I had quite a bit of time after classes or between classes that I would go into the jewelry shop and just kind of look around and figure things out. Well, that progressed into actually making jewelry, doing investments in casting, a lot of polishing, solder jobs, things like that, where you're resizing rings, some stone setting. I never really got into engraving or anything like that, but the problem is that around the 2010 2011 time frame, we were still in a pretty pretty deep recession, as it were, and the price of gold, because of these investment strategies and everything, was skyrocketing. Several $1,000s an ounce, and platinum was high, rhodium was high, gold was high, and the problem is that silver jewelry was not in vogue at the time. If you want white gold or yellow gold, that was where it was at, because you can rhodium plate them and make them look like platinum, or platinum was in. And so I would do silver jewelry to try to keep the passion alive and everything, but it just got very cost prohibitive. Like, I made a ring one time that I had several $100s of material in, and it didn't sell it just didn't sell. And there's not a lot you can do other than melt down your materials, pop your stones out, and rework things if they don't work out. And that was kind of frustrating. And then my school schedule changed, my work schedule changed, and I got out of it. So it's cost prohibitive. There's a lot that goes into it, and the timing just wasn't right anymore. So I skipped out of that after a while, then moved on to another job where I was working full time in a heavy cybersecurity company, and then eventually got a divorce after Evelyn was born and everything. The divorce was not related to the fact that Evelyn had any type of congenital heart defect or anything. It was just a difference of opinion, what they consider unreconcilable differences on paper. So, but I love my daughter. I would do absolutely anything for her, and I think that some people might argue about the sanctity of marriage, but honestly, in this case, a divorce was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it turned me into a different type of person for the sake of my daughter. So I really feel that her life has benefited a lot from it. But
Okay.
yeah, so that's kind of the journey through jewelry, as it were.
So there was, I guess there was a gap of time between jewelry making and knife making.
Yeah, that's right. Several years.
Okay.
I yeah, you know I'd been talking to a buddy of mine that I ended up working with, two separate jobs. And in the second job, he was watching Walter Sorrell's videos and Aaron Gaw or Gow, and he was like, it'd be really cool to make knives. And we kind of talked about it. He kind of put the idea in my ear, but we never really got to do that together. So I ended up starting out with some basic materials, doing a lot of research, and I started making them. And I found out that in this company that I was working in, inside of the solution architecture team, that one of the guys that I talked to regularly, his dad was a knife maker of like 35 plus years, and his name's John Weaver, two E's, and he was best friends and mentored by Clay Galt and Martin Pullen. And if anybody's familiar with the old timey Texas knife makers or some of the early guild members, Martin and Clay were both members and have some still pretty high standard works, if you consider today, from pocket knives from Poland, and a bunch of fixed blades from Galt. And John was also a guild member, so I kind of got introduced a little bit to the guild through their legacy. So that's kind of how things got started there. But John, the reason why he wasn't doing knives regularly is because he found out he had pancreatic cancer, and he was going through treatment for that. He had a Whipple procedure, and pancreatic cancer, the survival rate's not great, and he managed to tough it out, get the Whipple, and I think, if I remember correctly, he was in the hospital for like 18 months or something like that, off and on or whatever, going through all these treatments, and the surgery was pretty devastating to his physical health. And when he got out, I started talking to him, because he went through a move while he was sick, and most of his stuff was in storage, and he was rebuilding his shop with another buddy that he had mentored, and I, through some conversations, was able to talk to him more and get mentored in knives. But it's kind of serendipitous how I got into knives. It started out with like this kind of transition from expensive jewelry making, like working metal with jewelry, to trying to find something to occupy myself and get my hands dirty again, with knives, into talking to John's son and getting introduced to him, which I think kind of springboarded me into like this can be a lot larger deal than just a hobby. And John was a full-time knife maker for quite a while after he retired out of insurance. So that was kind of an inspiration.
We may get back to that in a little bit, but you'd mentioned, and I forget if it's in private conversations or if it was in last week's podcast, or or even if you mentioned it today. But you grew up hunting and fishing. What experience did you have with knives growing up? Like, did you like knives? Did you go out and get knives? I mean, I remember, not to hijack the question, but I remember as a kid us riding our bicycles up to the pawn shop and buying Pakistan knives, stuff like that. But what is your experience with knives growing up?
My earliest recollection of knives probably has to center around my grandmother was bequeathed some property along with her two siblings, and my great uncle and great aunt and grandmother all had this what we called the cabin, which is maybe 35 minutes down the road. I think it was like 100 some acres, and it was all dirt roads there in the Appalachians in Pennsylvania. And one time my grandparents were down at the cabin, and they found a two-bladed muskrat trapper on the road. So like when you went in and out of the cabin, there was a gate, and they would stop outside by the road to close the gate behind them. They found this trapper, this muskrat trapper, and brought it home, and it sat in a shotgun or a shot glass on their shelf. And for whatever reason, my grandmother was like, "That this is your knife, Aaron. When you get old enough to open it, you can have it." And it was a nail breaker. It was a trial of will. So I don't know what I was doing, like strengthening my fingers. I was trying to do finger push-ups and everything. I'm like, I'm going to get this knife sooner than later. Well, I got the knife, and I'm pretty sure I cut myself for the first few times I opened it, and I carried it around until maybe I was like 6 or something like that when I first got it, and it was my prized possession. I probably carried it for 4 years, and then I lost it. I had no idea where it went. And I had other knives around that time too, like Swiss Army knives, like the small ones, mostly knockoffs that you could get at the dollar store, because the Swiss Army brand was a little bit expensive in the 90s, but the especially for a poor Appalachian boy. But my grandfathers were World War II vets. They both carried mostly slip joints around, some lockbacks, not many fixed blades, except I mean, they kind of just dabbled. Like my one grandfather had bayonets from World War II. My other grandfather was a pig farmer, in addition with some other things, and would have some fixed blades around, especially like K-bar style hunters and whatnot. My dad had some knives, not anything impressionable to me, but it was mostly my grandfather's that shaped my early knife impressions, because their collections at times were pretty big. My one grandfather, who was a bomber in World War II, had this large Craftsman red tool case in his shop, and he had several drawers dedicated to his slip joints and lockbacks. Anything from uh, gentlemen's knives to Barlows to several buck lockbacks and things like that. So I mean, it would be difficult for me to tell exactly what the brands were. Camelus, Buck, you name it, probably Schrade. But he was born in the early 20s, so I mean, he had a lot of knives, especially from when he was a kid. So that's kind of it. It was born out of an early childhood desire to be a Boy Scout, even though I never was. And whether it was hatchets or saws or pocket knives or Bowie knives. We in the north they called them Bowie knives at the time, but I was quickly retrained on that when I moved down to Texas. That's kind of where it all started.
Did you ever get into Chinese ninja throwing stars?
Not really. Not really. Mostly. I taken karate for a while, and it's funny that you say ninja stars because I didn't gravitate as much towards ninja stars or kunais or things like that as I did samurai swords and kendo sticks and things like that. So I stayed. I had some like a knockoff samurai sword and some kendo sticks, and my brother and I would beat the tar out of each other with those, pretending we were samurai. So yeah, no, but ninja stars are pretty interesting. I just could never throw a knife worth anything, so I kind of stuck to what I was good at, was just long slices.
What made me think that is when you said about hatchets and stuff, and it just kind of came to my mind. But when I was in middle school, we would go to the mall. We would go to Memphis because there wasn't a mall in Batesville or anything. But if we went to Memphis sometime, like with a youth trip or something, and they had one of those stores there that sold knives and ninja stars and stuff, and we'd buy those ninja stars. I'd go out in the backyard and try to throw them against the fence, and it would never fail that there'd be a little bitty crack in the fence, and that thing would fly through that crack, never to be seen again. But those were pretty fun at the time. Um, so a couple of questions with that. Did you have a favorite kind of knife, and were you able to? You said that was your granddad that had that large collection, I believe. Did you, when he passed away, did you get any? Were you able to get a knife or anything from that collection?
No, well, I had lots of favorite knives. Like that double blade trapper, like to me is just quintessential. I was actually able to find what I believe is uh, the exact same model. It's a Schrade. No, it's a camelist version with some Bakelite, faux stag handles. And I think I posted it up on my Instagram at some point in time. But when my grandfather passed, he only had daughters from his first marriage, and when he married my grandmother before I was born, her son, my uncle, was the only male heir that he had, and for whatever reason, he decided that he was going to give all the things that a male heir should have, like his guns and his knives and his tools, to my uncle. And my grandmother very, very clearly said, you can have some hats or ties or things like that, but you cannot have his knives because they're your uncle's. And I was like, man, I was like, I just want one.
Yeah,
But I mean, I'd always admired him from the time I can remember, for
right.
like five maybe. Uh, and he didn't pass until I was 20 or 21.
No, okay.
But yeah, no, didn't get any of them.
Did you get a nice hat?
I did. Funny thing, we could talk about this if you really want to.
I was kind of
I
joking, but
used
if
to,
it's a good story, tell it.
no, it is because it's one of spite, and I'm all about that at times. But my sister and let me back up. I used to play classical violin, and I played it for quite a while. And in
I thought in the
several of my
Appalachians they call that a fiddle.
yeah, whatever. I mean, you can call it what you want, but it's classical violin or Scottish fiddle and an Appalachian fiddle. So like when I say fiddle, I mean like the style that I'm playing. I don't know if when anybody's playing Mozart, you consider a fiddle playing Mozart, but unless you're jazzercising it or whatever. But um, I played in the Scottish Highland Games out in Ligonier, Pennsylvania, so near Pittsburgh, and Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. And while we were there, we bought a hat, like a trucker cap for my grandfather that said Scotland on it. And we brought that back, and I think my little sister had picked it out for him, but it was at an event that I brought the family to because I was competing, and so by happenstance, it was one of the hats that was in the mess of hats that my grandfather had when he passed, and I nabbed it. So my sister probably would have gotten it if she would have thought enough about it, but I was and ended up able to keep it. So that and a few like commemorative World War II hats that were like caps from like the USS something or other. I got to keep, and some of his ties that I remember us him wearing when we go to church and things, and or he'd go to
That's
my
neat.
concerts. Yeah, so I mean, as much as it's not a pocket knife, and as much as it's not the things I strictly remember him by, it's still something that I think about him with. And mostly for
That's
me,
cool.
my grandfather represented like a parental ideals. He was a life mentor for me, and so I might not have gotten anything really material out of that inheritance, but he taught me a lot of life lessons that I carry today, and I teach my kids. So as far as I'm concerned, I made out a lot better than just getting a few trinkets from him.
Yeah, that's really nice. That is far better. So the different knives that you grew up and grew around, did they have any influence on the ones that you make today? I mean, I remember, I think I talked about this a little last week, is that for me, um, me and my dad always had slip joints, and that's kind of made me gravitate to slip joints, and I don't think I talked about it, but I was fascinated very early on with automatics, and that kind of led me to want to do that. So, what knives growing up, being around, having, how has that influenced what you make today, or something that you have a desire to make?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I am a big fan of slip joints. I I like lockbacks as well, and I also like automatics, mostly Italian style stiletto automatics. But mostly, what got me into this the slip joint realm is that early throwback to muskrats and barlows and trappers and gentlemen's knives. And what I'm trying to do today is follow more in the footsteps of Tony Bowes in making traditional patterns. And Tim Robertson has been mentoring me on slip joints, and he's makes traditional pocket knives as well. And so I would say like third iteration of traditional pocket knife maker. So that's that the traditional pocket knife and antique pocket knives is really kind of what I gravitate towards, even though I'm not really opposed to making modern patterns. I really do have a special place in my heart for traditional patterns.
Have you had any interest in like tactical style folding knives, liner locks or frame locks or anything like that? Have you done any of that, or have you just mainly steered toward the more traditional patterns?
I've only done traditional patterns and the Dino or Dino from Kurt Romano so far. I have all the tooling for liner locks, and I will probably at some point in time get into that. But something that you have to understand about my knife shop that I purchased is I inherited quite a bit of Martin Pullen's liner lock patterns, and you might see some of those reminiscent in Johnny Stout's work, because I believe that they had some type of relationship when Johnny was starting to make knives and everything. But you will see that the liner lock style from Martin Pullen is something that I actually have been studying quite a bit. So I will eventually try to revive the specific pattern that I have that's from Martin. That's a mixture of a kind of like a standard liner lock with, I believe it has a like a tanto edge to it, that I think is pretty cool because some of his influences was in Japanese style, like Quakens and tanto style blades that he had put out. So I'd like to actually try to replicate some of his past work as well in liner lock form. Maybe not so much tactical, but there's a kind of fusion there with liner locks and what Martin was doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think when I asked the question, maybe in my mind, maybe tactical wasn't the right word, because not all liner locks are tactical, right? Most tactical knives folders are liner locks. Maybe that's a true statement or a true-ish statement, but not all. Like I wouldn't consider Johnny's stuff. You bring up Johnny, I wouldn't consider his stuff tactical. I mean, gentleman. Uh, almost. I don't know if you'd call it jewelry, but fancy. Like that. And so, yeah, that's a good distinction. Not all liner locks are. tactical. But I guess maybe my question was really more: have you tried anything like in a? I would maybe consider liner locks being a more modern development than the slip joint because the slip joint's been around for so long. but you answered that question, so that's good. Now talk about. I want to get back to shop and equipment stuff here in a little bit, but talk about the knives that you make now, and talk about the knives. I guess start with the ones that when you first started making knives. What were you making? I mean, I know you've made. I think I've seen some kitchen knives. You were doing some bird knives for a while. Of course, folding knives, hunting knives. But kind of talk about when you got started. What knives did you start off making? And then how you've progressed through maybe different patterns to what you're doing now.
The first knives that I made were knife shaped objects more akin to prison shanks, which I mean, I think most of us would be remiss to share too much of our first knives. I really don't care. It was a early learning experience. I think my first knives were paring knives, just because like cooking and food prep were things that I was just very familiar with, and I've kind of stayed within that line early on because most of my work was cutlery. Then I progressed on after I bought John's shop to doing more hunting knives because I had a lot of patterns that were from Clay, Martin, and John that were knife oriented. And what you'll see today in my knives is several of them are actually either patterns that John or Clay made, and one of them, like that bird and trout knife that you have probably seen, is it originally came from a surgical set in, I believe, the turn of the century is what Clay took it off of, and they were scalpels that they used in surgery, and he would sell it in like a set of 3 or 5 for caping, and caping, for everybody who doesn't know, is when you remove the flesh from the shoulders up, typically on game kills, so that way the hide can be taxidermied on later on by a taxidermist. So in the field, you would cape a kill, and then you would send it off to the taxidermist, and hopefully you didn't mess with the pelt too much, so that way you didn't have to repair a bunch of holes and things. So old time game hunters would keep their own kills out. Now, if you go on an expensive hunt or you're hunting with a guide, most guides will cape it for you. So the days of yore and the safari club experience are a little bit less popular. And so when I saw that one blade, and I was like, that reminds me a lot about what was useful in knives when I was trout fishing a lot. And so I'm just going to rename it a bird and trout because it's exactly this kind of knife that I would use for game birds and trout fishing. So that's where kind of the progression has come. I've renamed some of the old patterns that were just like Skinner 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or things like that. The old timers would just name it for the function, and then it would be the function plus a number, and that was the name of the knife. Versus these convoluted names like bird and trout and whatnot now. But it's a little bit more palatable. Like some people are like, oh yeah, I can see that it's a perfect bird and trout knife. I'm like, well, if you knew where it came from, it was really to cut open people originally, but it went from cutting open people to caping game to bird and trout and EDC. I mean, you can carry it as a everyday carry as well. It's pretty small, dainty, but very very sharp. So
Let me butt in real quick before you move on. So, and this just shows my ignorance, but when you talk about a bird and trout knife, is that literally for, I guess, skinning a bird or dressing a trout?
well, I guess it depends on how you're dressing or preparing a trout. I preferred, instead of scaling them, to just gutting them and taking their gills out and then cooking them whole. Filling them with, like, I don't know, rosemary or sage or something like that, and oil or butter, and cooking them that way whole. So for me, like, the gutting process is a lot easier on a thin or slender blade that could just get in there and cut them out. Now you can also fillet on it, but it doesn't have any flexibility, so it's maybe a little bit more difficult depending on who you are. I can fillet or gut fish with it. The same can be said for birds. Functionally, it's just thin, slender. You don't have to worry about puncturing things or cutting things that you really don't want to. So it makes it really easy because it just fits in the thumb and index finger with just a little bit of blade protruding, and it allows you to cut very efficiently.
I got you. So it's just for a different style of dressing game or fish. Okay, so picking up from there, you were making those style knives, and then pick your story up from there.
That's where I started. I was self-taught largely in knives because with John having cancer, he was too weak to actually get out there and grind. So most all of my experience in knife making was related to John looking at my work, telling me that it was shoddy or things that I did well, and then say, round over the handles more, or you have facets or things like that. And I would send him pictures sometimes, and he's like, "That's not really good enough. You're gonna have to bring him to me." And so I had to drive an hour down south to bring him to him so he could look at him once in a while. And we went back and forth like that for quite a while. And I don't think that there was really a time that I took myself too seriously in knives, but I decided in 20, I think it was 20, maybe 2021, if I remember correctly, to present my knives to the Texas Knifemakers Guild and have them inspected. And the standards for inspecting knives are a little bit different for the Texas Guild than they are for, I would say, I don't know what you call the guild, like the Knife Makers Guild. That's the international version, even though it's located in the United States, right? But the old, like your grandfather's guild type of thing. And I never thought I could get into the guild. Everything that everybody had said about the selection process and the time that it takes is fairly commensurate with the ABS, and I was like, I'm not there. So I took my blades to the Texas Guild, had them inspected and passed, and I decided to take them over to the guild table and have them just look at them and tell me what they thought. And there's a process or a bylaw in the guild where you can be fast tracked if the guild decides that your knives are of quality, where you really are considered, your work is considered passable during of normal inspection or whatever. So they looked at my knives and said, "Hey, you do a few things here, and we think that you'll pass." So I got fast tracked, which means that I didn't have to be guaranteed by 4 other guild members because of the board member decided that my knives were of good enough quality where I could go through the probationary period.
These are still fixed blades, right? This
Yeah,
is
that's
before
true.
you move to. Okay, all right. I'm just
Yeah,
trying to follow
yeah.
along there.
Yeah, sorry, ADD. But what you have to understand is that I've had a mind for pocket knives for a while before I went to I guess, validating my work through the guild and through peer review. And so when I started talking to you, it was like 2019, right after I bought the shop. And I was really considering getting into slip joints because that was something that I wanted to do next after doing cutlery and doing some, hunting and fishing knives. And then I picked back up when I started getting into slip joints when you and I were talking more because I was looking for a pantograph, and you turned me on to Tim Robertson, who was able to source me out one. But at that same time that I was talking with Tim, I was also going to some Texas shows, and I at ICCE before Blade had officially taken over everything. I went and got my knives inspected, and I went down the path of the guild. So I kind of stepped back a little bit and said, I'm going to do what I know the best, which is fix blades while I was going through the inspection process. So probationary and then on the voting member status and doing all these shows because I was taking feedback for fixed blades. I wasn't taking feedback for slip joints. And so I kind of held off on making anything other than prototypes while I was going through the inspection process with the guild. And once I was nearing the end of getting my voting member status, I started picking up slip joints again. And now what I'm looking at is not necessarily pivoting away entirely from fixed blades, but doing kind of both. I want to do fixed blades that are really intriguing to me, and I don't really know what else to say about that. I haven't really figured out what envelope I want to push with fixed blades. But the mechanisms for slip joints really interest me, and I'd like to spend maybe about 70% of my time working on slip joints and 30 on fixed blades of my interest. So I don't know if that'll always end up being hunting fixed blades or things like that, but I'd like to eventually incorporate hunting into slip joints, so like making hunting size slip joints and lockbacks that kind of have that intended purpose, so that they're kind of built for certain tasks inside of hunting.
You should make you one of those old William Skagel style big fixed blades with the slip joint in the back end. Have you ever seen that knife?
I actually think I have. I think I know what you're talking about, but probably not. It seems I don't know if I want to muddy the waters doing fixed blades with slip joints on them, but it is funny to me the kind of quirkiness of knife making, because I was listening to the Catch Bit show with Jason Ritchie and Mike Moran, and they were talking about Stanhope knives. Do you know what a Stanhope knife is?
I don't think so.
So they have this little like filament, or yeah, it's a little picture where if you look through this little pinhole, you can see an image. And these things are like put everywhere, but they showed up in some pocket knives. And I guess I can't remember if it was Anheuser Busch had made a bunch of knives, or had knives made with the Stanhope in them. And so you can find them every once in a while, but if you look through this little peephole or whatever inside the scales, I believe it is, you can see a little image in it. And it's quirky, but it's fun. It's like there's just these little things, like somebody decided, oh hey, I'm gonna take this technology and I'm gonna incorporate it in knives, and then somebody else thought that was kitschy and then popularized it, and nobody remembers it anymore unless you're a knife historian or a collector. So I guess there is a place for fixed blades with slip joints on them, but I uh, I could see myself going down a rabbit hole if I decided to reproduce old, like obscure blade designs or things like that. So it interests me, but not to the point where I'd actually make it, I don't think.
Yeah. I was just kind of teasing about it anyway. I mean, that thing's, for you mentioned, I think last week that, we're kind of in this different era with knives and what's expected. You look at some of the old stuff, like some of that Skagel stuff, which I'm sure was revolutionary at the time, but my word, of course, what he had to work with is so much different than what we have to work with. But anyway, so did John make slip joint knives?
Yes, yeah, he made both slip joints and liner locks. I don't know to like that he made a large volume of them. His forte was definitely fixed blades, but I know that he dabbled in both of them. So maybe he made like 50 or less. I can't really remember what the number was, but there was some slip joints and lockbacks and some liner locks, and I don't have any reference to any of them because most of his work is in private collection.
So how did you make the jump, or what was it, from fixed blades to slip joints? Your first, I guess, transition. Did you have a pattern and you just kind of did it on your own, or how did you make that original jump?
I bought a few books. I watched a bunch of stuff online. I ended up taking an old trapper case pattern, and that was already apart, and I traced everything out and kind of made my first example there. So I don't think I ground the blade on it, but it had pretty good walk and talk, and I kind of stopped there because I was like, this is a perfect stopping point for me to give to my 6-year-old at the time, so that way she can carry. I rounded over the tip, and so she can carry it around and she can strengthen her fingers to get used to opening up slip joints, but she doesn't have to really worry about the hazards of cutting herself badly like I did. So yeah, she has it in her little collection. She has like knife stuff that I'll give her every once in a while. Like she'll come out and say, "Hey, Dad, can I have this?" And I'm like, "No, that's an expensive set of stag handles. You cannot have that." But she has some like Rocky Mountain sheep horns, some camel bone. She has an old whale vertebrae disc. She has some Usyk. She has a bunch of box elder burl scales. So she's slowly pilfering just about every piece of handle material that I have. But one day
She'll
I'm just
sell
going
it
to tell
back
her,
to you.
yeah, maybe, or she'll say, "Hey, like I have this nice set of stag that I finally got from you. Will you make me a knife out of it?"
Well, she's gonna get her fingers good and strong, and if y'all ever come back across that Barlow, she'll pass the test.
Yeah, muskrat, but who's counting?
Oh, muskrat.
Um,
Yeah. Okay. My
yeah,
bad.
yeah, yeah. Actually, I have it. I have this one that I bought. It's a cameless one that I found on eBay. I found it, and it's man. If memory serves, it's the same kind of one that I had, and that it is a nail breaker. Like I'm telling you, I don't. They did not make those for the weaks of fingers back then. I think it was like a 1970s version of this two blade trapper, but actually there's a two blade like a double blade trapper. I think it's a trapper and a Warncliffe that was a Tony Bose pattern that Tim has reproduced as well, and I really like that. So what I'm planning on doing is I'm getting to a point where I'm going to move on to multi blades, and I'm going to start with a two blade trapper, with the trapper blade and spay blade, and then once I get comfortable with being able to flush up and get the timing right on that knife, then I think I'm going to move to the Tony Bose muskrat knife, which if memory serves me correctly, that uses catch bits in it for the spring mechanism and everything. So it'll be a learning curve, but it's easier to do a two blade trapper than it is a muskrat based on the fit up and everything, just because of the spring geometry and the catch bits that need to go in there. So that'll be kind of
Oh,
maybe I'll get there at the end of the year this year.
yeah. That'll be neat. That's a good goal there. Going back to you bought the shop. Well, let me ask you this: John still had his shop, if I'm following your story correctly, when you started making knives, correct? Like you didn't buy it from him because he was still making knives when you started. Is that right?
Um, he, yeah, he when I started, he was still making knives, but I didn't know him. And then
Uh huh.
he got cancer and packed everything up when he was moving. And then when I got to know him, he had his shop set back up, but he was too weak really to make knives.
Gotcha.
So so yeah, he wasn't making knives anymore really when he and I got together. And I guess he finds some times of strength where he'd go out and grind some things or work in Ron's shop, who was the other knife maker that he had mentored that lived down in Glenrose area. But I never saw him grind a blade or really do any of that type of stuff. So
Well, what kind of equipment then did you have? What kind did you start off with?
I started off with a 1x30 Harbor Freight Special, and I think I had maybe a disc sander from them. And other than that, I built a file, one of those file jigs that you can do the bevels on and everything early on. And then I've realized that it's a little bit more elbow grease than I wanted to put into it. So I got the 1x30 grinder. That lasted a little while. I was doing all my heat treating in an old smoker firebox. I was mostly doing O1 at the time, which honestly it was pretty easy to heat treat. I was actually using canola oil. There's a lot of things that I would do differently if I knew that I could buy a little bit better oil and a little bit better equipment, then I would have probably done that. But I didn't really know any better. I just kind of went cheap just to see if I liked it. And then the very next thing I bought when I was starting to talk to John is he said, I have this extra 2x72 grinder. It was an old Burr King, and he said it's just been sitting there. He said if you want it, I'll sell it to you cheap. And I was like, okay. I was like, what is cheap? And he sold it to me, I think, for $1,800, which that was a big purchase for me. at the time. $1,800 for a grinder when the most I had spent was maybe about $150 or $200 on equipment. But I saved up and I bought it, and I still have it through a weird set of horse trading. I traded it back to John for a surface grinder, that it's old Boyer and Schultz one. And then when John was consolidating his worldly possessions and stuff and started to give things away to his kid, he gave the Burr King that I had purchased originally and then traded back to him. I outfitted it with a flat platen and everything, but he gave it to his son, another son, not the one I worked with, and then he gifted it to me. He said, I'm not going to use this. You'll get a lot better mileage out of it, and you'll appreciate it, especially considering I put a lot of money into upgrading the flat platen and everything. And so I still have that old Burr King that I started learning on. Like the equipment has slowly increased. Like I have a knee mill and two 2x72s, technically three if you want to consider the AMK horizontal. I mean, it is 2x72, but it's a horizontal grinder and things like that. But I haven't really bought a lot of extra equipment in the last few years. I'm pretty well established on what I have.
So as you're adding equipment to your shop and stuff, what was there any one piece of equipment that you felt like allowed you to make a leap forward in production? We talked about before that you don't really need surface grinders, you don't need horizontal grinders and all that stuff to make a good knife, but it does make it easier to do precision work. What have you found that is like a tool that you would not want to go back to not having, that's really helped you move forward in making the kinds of knives that you are making and want to make going forward?
Well, that's a really difficult question because I'm conflicted on my answer.
What tools? Three
Yeah,
tools.
okay. I will
Favorite
say,
tools.
yeah, I will say the 2x72 increased the consistency of my bevels, and it made it a lot easier on the cleanup process. And you can spend forever trying to hand sand, or you can try to grind it out correctly. And it's just a 2x72, a good one, makes that transition to doing really great bevels a lot easier. The second would be a disc grinder, which helps me with flattening out scales and making some grinds that I just can't really get as easily on a 2x72. And the third would be my surface grinder. And you don't have to have any of them. You can make a knife mostly from files and everything. That's true. But if I had to break it all down, I probably would not replace the 2x72. I think that's almost an essential tool to me.
Yeah, thinking about making slip joints and autos, I didn't really consider my 2x72 just because it just seems so standard. But having a good variable speed disc sander is really nice for making slip joints, for getting that that lock area, or not lock, I guess, but I don't even know what that area is called. We talked about this before. Knife nomenclature and what do you call these things? The spring notch, some people call it, whatever that,
Yeah.
the back there. But getting that nice and square, that for me, so it's the disc sander and the horizontal belt grinder. I was up at Jay Nelson's when we were working on his videos, and he had one. And I guess that maybe that's, well, actually, I saw one in Chad Nichols' shop, but didn't see him running it or really using it. But Jay was using it for doing some profiling on around his knife and everything. And I was like, man, to get those back square like that, it's like I've got to. So that was the next tool, that big tool purchase that I made after coming back and seeing that. But yeah, for folders and for autos, I'd have to say the disc sander and the horizontal belt grinder, in addition to the vertical grinder for me. But yeah, kind of the
Yeah.
same answers.
I guess the anatomy you're talking about is the back square and run up. I think that's what Tony Bose
That's a
established,
pretty
right?
good technical name. Yeah.
Yeah, the back square and run up. I would agree. So I do work on the back square and run up with my disc sander, but I don't have a variable speed. It's just a 110 volt single speed, which I'd have to replace the motor on it. So I just I'm very particular about it. But I actually have a modified grinder, like tool grinder, that has each abrasive disc is kind of like a surface grinder disc, and they're cut at a 45. And I learned this trick from Tim Robertson, so I can do quite a bit of the back square and run up work and cutting in my choils in on that grinder versus having to use my disc sander. But the horizontal, there are some tools that instantaneously make you a better knife maker, and it's not because you actually become a better knife maker. It's because the tool is a fit for purpose type of tool, and the horizontal grinder is definitely one of those. Like, you can fight with facets, and you can fight with not having square spines or square material, and hand sand everything or file it or whatever. But if you have a horizontal grinder, you can definitely make it a lot easier on yourself intuitively. The one thing I will say about horizontal grinders is I was kind of spoiled in some ways, because when I bought John's knife shop, he had bought a Wilmot grinder, and the Wilmot grinder, I think it's the Tag 101 version, is what I have, actually goes horizontal. But the problem is I was timing each one of my operations to get through a knife, and I realized that anytime I'm trying to flip a my 2x72 horizontally, I was taking about 30 minutes of time in setup, because if you have a work rest, you have to flip it around to the horizontal position. You got to square it to your flat platen or to your wheel, and the setup time just took a lot of time. And so I have my Burr King set up with a flat platen and everything is square, and that never gets touched. And then my Wilmont, I sometimes will switch between a flat platen if I'm slack belting, or if I'm using my 14-inch contact wheel. And then I just recently bought the AMK horizontal grinder, and that is for all of my flats in the horizontal position. So I can grind and polish to specification on slip joints, whereas I would have a hard time going back and forth on machines when I was doing it before, and then doing a lot of hand sanding and polishing by hand. So they're all efficiency tools. I mean, the at the end of the day, I'd say the horizontal grinder instantaneously made my knives look better, though.
My grinder, my 2x72, as I told you before, was a 8-inch bench grinder with a multi-tool attachment. And then I took the top wheel off the multi-tool attachment, and I put some angle iron so I could extend it to run, instead of running 2x36-inch belts, it could run 2x72-inch belts. And then, so I ran it that way for a long time. And then I decided I wanted a variable speed grinder. So I cut a hole in my bench and put a treadmill motor with a speed controller under the bench, ran me a pulley up to the other side of the bench grinder, and then I had variable speed. So it was a janky setup. I should find an old picture of it and post it to my Instagram. But when I was finally able to purchase a legitimate 2x72, I was looking at a combo, one that I could do both operations. I could run it upright or I could run it horizontal, and got on some of the knife forums and was asking around, and for the exact reason that you mentioned, I ended up going with one that was not convertible, because with slip joints, there are times where you just need to go back and forth from one to the other. And to think about having to reset and reline up the grinder every time, someone advised me to save my money and buy one of each. And that's what I ended up doing. I mean, it took me a while to get the horizontal after I purchased the vertical, but I have no regrets, and really felt like it was the best option. So what you mentioned there is so true about that. So let's talk a little bit about people who've been influential in your knife making journey. Now, you mentioned John Weaver. Was he the first knife maker that you really came across that offered you help? And you mentioned Tim Robertson as being a mentor. Who are some of the people along your journey that's helped you get to where you are today?
Oh man.
You
I
don't have to name them all.
yeah, I really rest on the shoulders of giants, right? There's been a lot of people that have just accepted and fielded a lot of stupid questions from me because I asked copious amounts of stupid questions. And John volunteered a lot of information because I think that he felt compelled because he was selling me the legacy in his shop to make sure I didn't botch anything. So I learned a lot about the old way of making knives from him. Tim Robertson, obviously, he has single handedly contributed the most to my knife making knowledge when it comes to not only slip joints but also just good knife aesthetic, right? Don Hansen's given me some pointers. There's a lot. I really appreciate Bill Ruppel and the guys in the slip joint cartel because of the Texas style of knives that they make. But I've always gravitated more towards the Tony Bose camp of knife making, and so I would say I followed Tony Bose for quite a while, and I never actually got to talk to him. I think I was too scared in some ways or apprehensive because I was like, this guy's fielding questions from everybody, and he has a lot of people coming to him all the time, and I'm just not going to contribute to that. And when he passed, I felt like that was a missed opportunity. I did the same thing with A.G. Russell because I was like, this guy knows so much. I used to work in Springfield, Missouri, and I would drive up there maybe once a month, and I always rode by A.G. Russell's shop, and I just never stopped because I was like, I'm just a nobody. I don't know why I would why he'd want to waste his time with me, and I missed that opportunity as well. So anymore, I've lost the lack of nerve. I'll just ask people and try to ingratiate myself to talking to them, just for the sake of just getting a little bit of their time and understanding their personality and things, and gaining some perspective, but respectfully, so I'm not just wasting their time. There's lots of artists. There's lots of people that I look at their work and I admire it. And I'm like, if I could be a knife maker of repute, reputation or whatever you call it. I don't know if there's a negative connotation with repute, but of a of
Ill
some of
repute.
yeah ill repute of repute, right? It, if I want to be that kind of knife maker, there are a lot of really good examples out there, and not just old time knife makers or really well experienced knife makers. There's a lot of guys that are coming up that, man, they just have a touch to them. They know the aesthetic, they know finish, and those things are, if they're not intuitive to them, they make it look really intuitive. And so I kind of just absorb everybody's work and admire them and just use that as something to spur me on to kind of ideate on my own ideas of what I think a knife should look like, and that's really what I'm focused on.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that was going to be one of my follow up questions. Was, whose work do you find inspiration from? And I'm thinking like, I guess asking the question more from who's out there now doing work that you, and you mentioned Tony Bose, but he's passed away. You mentioned Tim with the aesthetics and stuff, and Don. Is there anybody else that you kind of look to their work as inspiration for the direction that you may want to go?
Well, I'm going to go back to Tim Robertson for a minute and kind of just explain what interests me or intrigues me about his work, because even though Tim has been a really good knife maker for a while, I think that he has going full time has just reached a different echelon of making. In knives, everybody's interpretation of a pattern might be different, and some of it's regional, some of it's who taught you. And I feel at least that when Tony was reviving old patterns, that his eye was for making it resemble as closely as he could the old way, so that the old patterns that were established way back when, but then making that pattern repeatable and making it more modern, right? So if you look at some of his trapper styles, or what he did with the Zulu spear. I mean, spear points have been around for a long time, but the Zulu spear is a pattern that's uniquely Tony. And Tim is raising the bar on the way that he looks at knife aesthetic and finish, because if you look at his blades, they represent the way that a pattern should look. Like the fit and finish, the blade attitude, the action, everything about that is so well thought out. And he's establishing what I call pattern provenance. All right. In his knives, Tony did that with his. Like if you look at something that comes out of a certain maker, we collectively think about that being the standard for the pattern. And you might see somebody else, like my first few Zulu spears did not really look like Tony Bow's patterns. They looked a little jank, and I'm not saying that they were bad, but they were just, it was my interpretation of it until I could actually make it as true to that pattern provenance as Tony made it. And Tim has really kind of helped me reaffirm that I am interested in making traditional patterns, but traditional patterns that follow the same pattern and the same line structure and everything like that, and doing that operationally, figuring out how to do that in my shop where I can do the same thing every time. So from Zulu spear to Zulu spear, you're not looking at a different take on a Zulu spear. You're looking at as close to that pattern as I can possibly get, and then working at other things like the blade action and whatnot. Additionally, so I have to say, like I'm really, every time I see Tim do something a little bit different, like these Zulu spear midlocks that he's been putting out, I'm constantly reminded of just how much depth as a maker he has. And that's the kind of maker that I want to be, where I can always reinvent myself and I can always increase my own bar. And there's people that I look at in the industry who are doing that same thing. And those are the kind of people I try to maybe not associate with, but take inspiration from. And there's too many to name, because there's just a bunch of people, especially in slip joints, that are doing things like that they're really establishing pattern provenance, and that's something I'm excited about.
All right, man. So I've got one more question, and then we'll call it a night. So, what advice would you give a knife maker just starting out? Somebody that maybe they've not started knife making, or maybe they've only been doing it for a very short period of time. Knowing what you know now, what advice would you give somebody wanting to make knives, or who's just started making knives?
Sure. um I'm going to answer this in not a roundabout way, but a long way, because I think that you're asking a pretty profound question that comes from me and from a deep place. All right. So if I'm giving somebody advice, I wanted to be clear what the context is. There's a cinematographer whose name is Brad Rushing, and he's made movies and he's made music videos, and he's pretty prolific. All right. And on a video that you can probably look up on YouTube or whatever, there was a specific there's a specific quote that he gave, and it was just it was just in regard to his own work, and it was that you just have to be prolific. Basically, you have to put the time in order to achieve things, right? Like there's no accolade for just making a knife. There's no award that's going to validate you. There's no it doesn't matter whether you're part of the ABS, the guild, or whether you have a ton of followers on Instagram. There's nothing that is going to validate you more than your own self-esteem. And I'm not talking about overinflating your own ego or your own work, but that you look at something and you find it good and you're proud of it, right? And that changes over time. Like as you get good at something, as you start to master it, you get to this point where it doesn't matter. It's splitting hairs as to how flat your spring is, or how good your hand rub finish is, or things like that. Like you got all the mechanics down. The next step really is in, if you're looking for, if you're looking to leave an impression on the world, then you have to be prolific. You got to put the time in. You got to do the work, and it's not work in one knife a year. It's not work in 1,000 production knives. It really is just in consistent work where you show improvement, and you're constantly trying to reinvent yourself and push your own envelope. And that is something that I've had to learn the hard way, because going through the guild process, I was really looking for validation from all the people who were inspecting my knives. And I kind of lost sight of why I was doing knife making, what I was trying to achieve. And so I've really, over the last few years, have been getting back to that, where I'm doing it for my own reasons. That's my inspiration. And the natural progression of that is that people look at my work and they like what I am doing, not trying to emulate somebody else so much. So if I can give a piece of advice to a new knife maker is, you know, expensive equipment, cheap equipment, validation from the interwebs or not. If you are not finding satisfaction and challenge in your own endeavor in knives, then I don't think that you're going to go as far. That self drive and self determination is really what will take you the farthest.
I think that's some good advice, and it makes me think, as you were saying that, it made me think about social media for all that it's worth. I mean, for all of its benefits as a marketing tool. And if you've looked at my Instagram or you looked at my Facebook, I primarily use social media as a marketing tool. But it's very easy to get caught up in what one might consider validation in social media. So you build something new, you post it out there, and I think it's natural to want people to like you, or want for people to like your work, and I think it's a trap that is easy to fall into, where you can get to the point of thinking that that's where real validation comes from. And if you put something out there and you don't get a bunch of likes or whatever, well, it's not good, or something like that. And along the lines of what you're saying, as far as advice to a new maker, as far as advice to anyone, is that we don't get it. That's not where our true worth, our true validation comes from. And I think that's why, I know I'm getting off on another tangent, but I think that's why we see so many people today doing things on social media that you think, why in the world are they doing that? I'm thinking about younger people doing crazy stuff because of the rush of this false validation, and instead of people finding their own worth in themselves, and their worth in their creator, and their worth in what they do. And so, yeah, I'm glad you said that, because it does raise the point that we should not look to others for our worth or for our validation. And maybe that's not what you were saying, but maybe that's just what came to my mind, is that that we should do our best. And it kind of goes back to maybe a little bit about what we were talking about last week, and about how we have this, we're made in the image of God, and we have this ability to create. And when we create for the purpose of creating, then we find satisfaction, we find joy in it, and we should find joy in it regardless of what others may think, regardless if we get a bunch of likes on it or not. And I think that's some good advice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree. It's that idea that the internet really is a facade. What you see is it's a conflagration of what you put out there and what people perceive. All right. But that's not who you are. Like who you are is the sum total of your experiences and your, your ability to know who you like, what you're worth. And I will tell you this, I know Instagram, like Instagram accounts that have 15,000 plus followers, and the only thing that they get is a bunch of makers asking for their secrets. I know, I know people who barely have a social media footprint that sell everything single knife they make, and they have backlogs of people wanting their work. I know people who you would think that every single knife that they make sells really quickly, and it doesn't. And I guess it depends on what your motivation is. But if the sum total of the reason why you're doing something is to be popular, I don't know. Knives is not it. I mean, art in general is not it. I mean, look at all the great artists. There's a reason why they call them starving artists. Bruce Bump told me one time it's either feast or famine, and there's an awful lot of famine in there. and and coming from a maker who's made some of the most extraordinary, like mind-boggling mechanisms and beautiful works of art in history, right? He'll never admit to that. Like he doesn't. He's a very humble, honest man. But he has experienced the famine and the lack of sellability, and falling out of the attention of some people, and I just think that there's more to knife making than social media right now, and it's more than selling knives at shows, and it's more than selling in general. It really is about pushing your own art form and expressing yourself. And if you focus on those things, the money will come, maybe sporadically, but I mean, there are definitely ways that you can make a business out of it, but you should first be learning to love yourself and love your creation. And when you do those things, you really will get to the heart of what makes a knife maker truly good and passionate and produce really good work. I think that if we talk to other people and ask those same type of questions, I think you'll find the common thread is that they just really love what they're doing.
Well, Aaron, I've enjoyed our conversation. I actually feel like I know you better now than I did an hour and a half ago when we got started. And so I appreciate you taking the time to let me interview you. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. It's a lot of probative questions. I felt like maybe I was a little bit lazier on your interview because I just shot from the cuff, but that's just kind of my style. But whatever the case may be, listeners, we really appreciate you tuning in and investing your time with us. It's a blessing in a lot of ways for Chris and I to be able to take the time to talk and to have you listen. And we want to just make sure that you know that you are loved, and God bless you, and we'll talk to you next time.